Brought to you by Penguin.
The Troubled Man, written by Henning Mankell, read by Sean Barrett. The moral right of the author has been asserted. People always leave traces. No person is without a shadow. You forget what you want to remember and remember what you would prefer to forget. Graffiti on buildings in New York City. Prologue. The story begins with a sudden fit of rage. The cause of it was a report that had been submitted the previous evening, which the Prime Minister was now reading at his poorly lit desk. But shortly before that, the stillness of the morning held sway in the Swedish government offices. It was 1983, an early spring day in Stockholm, with a damp fog hovering over the city and trees that had not yet come into leaf. When Prime Minister Olof Palme finished reading the last page, he stood up and walked over to a window. Seagulls were wheeling around outside. The report was about the submarines, the accursed submarines that in the autumn of 1982 were presumed to have violated Swedish territorial waters. In the middle of it all, there was a general election in Sweden, and Olof Palme had been asked by the Speaker to form a new government since the non-socialist parties had lost several seats and no longer had a parliamentary majority. The first thing the new government did was to set up a commission to investigate the incident with the submarines, which had never been forced to surface. Former Defence Minister Sven Andersson was chairman of the commission. Olof Palme had now read his report and was none the wiser. The conclusions were incomprehensible. He was furious. But it should be noted that this was not the first time Palme had got worked up about Sven Andersson. His aversion really dated back to the day in June 1963, just before midsummer, when an elegantly dressed, grey-haired 57-year-old man was arrested on Riksbron in the centre of Stockholm. It was done so discreetly that nobody in the vicinity noticed anything unusual. The man arrested was Stig Wennerström, a colonel in the Swedish Air Force who had been exposed as a spy for the Soviet Union. When he was arrested, the Prime Minister at the time, Tage Erlander, was on his way home from a trip abroad, one of his few holidays, to one of Reso's resorts in Riva del Sole. When Erlander stepped off the plane and was mobbed by a large crowd of journalists, not only was he totally unprepared, he also knew next to nothing about the incident. Nobody had told him about the arrest, and he had heard nothing about a suspicious Colonel Wennerström. It is possible that the name and the suspicions had been mentioned in passing when the Minister of Defence held one of his infrequent information sessions with the Prime Minister, but not in connection with anything serious, anything specific. There were always rumours circulating about suspected Russian spies in the murky waters that constituted the so-called Cold War. And so Erlander's response was less than illuminating. The man who had been Prime Minister without a break for what seemed like an eternity, 23 years to be exact, stood there open-mouthed and had no idea what to say, since neither Defence Minister Andersson nor anybody else involved had informed him of what was going on. During the last part of his journey home from Copenhagen to Stockholm, which barely took an hour, he could have been filled in and thus been prepared to say something to the excited journalists. But nobody had met him at Kastrup Airport and accompanied him on the last leg of the flight. During the days that followed, Erlander came very close to resigning as Prime Minister and leader of the Social Democrats. Never before had he been so disappointed in his colleagues in government. And Olof Palme, who had already emerged as Erlander's chosen successor, naturally shared his mentor's anger at the nonchalance that had resulted in Erlander's humiliation. Palme watched over his master like a savage bloodhound, as they used to say in circles close to the government. He could never forgive Sven Andersson for what he had done to Tage Erlander. Subsequently, a lot of people wondered why Palme included Andersson in his governments. However, it was not particularly difficult to understand why. Of course, Palme could have refused, but in practice it simply wasn't possible.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?